I inherited a forest. Not some tiny backyard plot, not a little patch of grass behind the house. 300 acres of woods that nobody in my family had talked about for decades. When my grandfather passed away, we were all expecting a modest house, a few savings accounts, maybe some old tools in the garage, and instead, tucked inside the will was this enormous tract of land that bordered a neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. And here's the kicker. Everyone in that subdivision had been walking, biking, and basically treating that forest like it was their backyard for years. Nobody had ever stopped to ask. Nobody had ever questioned it. They just assumed it belonged to the developer who had built their cookie-cutter homes back in the early 2000s. They were wrong. Dead wrong. The first time I actually set foot on my new property, I felt like I'd walked into someone else's imagination. There were trail signs nailed into the trees like some twisted, overzealous welcome mat. One big board at the entrance boasted, Willow Creek Community Nature Preserve, complete with little walking paths mapped out and benches that looked as though they'd been there forever. And I thought, okay, so this is what they've been doing while thinking it was theirs. But let me be clear, there was no deed transferring this land, no easement granting public access, nothing. According to standard procedure, maintaining a trail or tossing up a sign does not make you the owner of 300 acres. But here's the fun part. Try explaining that to 30 suburban moms and dads who have long since convinced themselves that the woods behind their houses are part of their HOA. I tried to be polite at first. I sent a letter, nice, civil, the kind of letter that starts with "Dear board members" and ends with "looking forward to your cooperation." I attached the survey, the property maps, highlighted the boundaries, pointed out the lines that clearly circumscribed my forest, and politely asked them to remove the signage, benches, and the trail maps. And then, radio silence. At first, I thought maybe they'd quietly comply. Maybe nobody wanted to rock the boat. But a week later, I drove by, and there they were, bright HOA logos still plastered on my trees, benches still in place, and a new addition, a little community garden sign someone had attached to a clearing that had never been cultivated before. They weren't just ignoring me, they were doubling down. It hit me then that this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was about power, about the subtle psychology of ownership. From a psychological trap perspective, people start to believe they have a right to something simply by using it consistently, by feeling it's theirs, even when legally it's not. And here's where the drama kicks in. The president of the HOA, a woman named Karen Stone, she called me personally. Imagine the sharpest tone you've ever heard, the kind of clipped, glass-shattering voice that makes you second-guess whether you left a cup in the fridge too long. She said, "We've maintained this land for years. It functions as community space. You can't just show up and tell us we don't own it." I smiled. Inside, I was trying very hard not to laugh, but outside I kept it polite. "According to the deed and property records," I said, "the entire tract is privately owned. There's no recorded easement or public right-of-way. So technically, this is my property." She didn't flinch, she doubled down. "Well, it's been in use for decades. You can't just take that away from the neighborhood." And then she hung up. I realized immediately that this was going to be bigger than a polite ask. This was the kind of HOA that thrived on social pressure, on convincing residents that their collective assumptions equaled legal rights. This is where it got tricky. Every weekend, hikers, joggers, and dog walkers would cross my property, oblivious to the fact that they were technically trespassing. They didn't mean harm, they just assumed it was public. But at some point, assumption collides with reality, and that collision can get messy. I could have ignored it, built a fence, and been done with it. But something about the audacity of those trail signs made me want to reclaim the space, not just legally, but symbolically. So I ordered a new survey. Bright orange stakes appeared at every corner of the property. Surveyors trudged through brambles and mud, marking the boundaries, confirming the deed line by line, foot by foot. And when it was finished, I had hard evidence. 300 acres, entirely mine. Not a square foot claimed by the HOA. Free of encumbrances, no easements, nothing. I felt a mix of vindication and responsibility. From a legal perspective, the HOA had no case, and yet human nature being what it is, I knew this wouldn't settle without some kind of confrontation. And confrontation came fast. The moment I started clearing invasive undergrowth near the entrance, setting up temporary markers to indicate private property, I could feel eyes on me. Residents came out, voices raised, questions fired like arrows. Who gave you the right? We've been using this land for generations. You can't just cut off access. I wanted to say, yes, I can. But instead I kept it calm, explained the survey, showed the deed, and tried to inject some humor. Apparently, I inherited more than your backyard views. Some chuckled nervously. Others scowled. Karen Stone, of course, was fuming. She organized an emergency board meeting at the community clubhouse, where I was invited to present my case. It felt like a courtroom drama in slow motion. The tension, the whispered commentary, the gasps when I projected the maps onto the wall. What I noticed most in that room, besides the obvious anger, was the underlying fear. Fear that control, however imagined, was slipping away. This is the subtle psychology at play in HOA disputes. Once people feel a resource is theirs, even if only psychologically, any attempt to reassert ownership triggers defensive aggression. I was no longer just a property owner. I was the embodiment of the intruder archetype in their narrative, the unwelcome reality that their perceived entitlement had limits. And that made every conversation, every email, every interaction electric with tension. At the same time, I was thinking strategically. I couldn't just barricade the land and call it a day. That would have created a full-blown war. But I also couldn't allow continued assumption of rights that weren't theirs. So I started mapping out the possibilities, imagining the land not just as a forest, but as a canvas. The idea formed slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. If the land was legally mine, why not manage it, protect it, and even let the public enjoy it, on my terms? I could see the looks on Karen Stone's face if I did that, the kind of dramatic irony that would make any storyteller giddy. Before I could even articulate the plan, the next confrontation hit. A group of residents, led by some of the HOA board members, physically walked onto the property during one of my weekend visits. They didn't yell, yet, but their presence was assertive, bordering on intimidation. I greeted them politely, introduced myself, and asked them to respect the property boundaries. One of them, a man named Tom Reynolds, leaned on a fence post, smirked, and said, "You can't really enforce anything here, not with how we've been using it. This is ours, whether you like it or not." I chuckled inwardly, thinking about the irony. Here were grown adults threatening legal trespass claims based purely on habit and perception. It was absurd, but that absurdity was exactly what made it cinematic. Over the next few weeks, I documented everything: calls, emails, photographs of the signs, trails, benches, and unauthorized structures. Every interaction was recorded, every boundary reinforced with clear markings, every legal document kept close. And the tension in the neighborhood ratcheted up steadily. Rumors started circulating. Apparently, the new owner is a stickler for rules. They're surveying everything. I heard a gate might go up. Little did they know, the gate wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a symbol of authority, the first concrete indication that my ownership was not just theoretical, it was actionable. And that, my friends, is where the first act of this story ends. The hook is set, the conflict is alive, the lines are drawn. The HOA assumed a forest they never owned. I inherited it, and the stage was set for a showdown that was part drama, part legal chess match, and all very, very human. The woods were quiet now, but not for long, and the next chapter would test not only property law, but ego, psychology, and the art of turning perceived loss into structured gain. Now, before we jump back into the chaos, let me explain something, because this is where a lot of people get confused. When folks hear a story like this, they immediately assume that if enough people use a piece of land long enough, it somehow becomes theirs. That sounds logical on the surface, but that and oppos, that's usually not how it works. According to standard procedure, property ownership is determined by recorded deeds, surveys, easements, and legal filings, not by neighborhood tradition. From a legal perspective, there are situations where long-term use can create certain rights, but those situations come with very specific requirements, timelines, and documentation. Simply maintaining a walking trail or installing a few benches doesn't and oppos team magically transfer ownership of hundreds of acres. And honestly, this is a psychological trap a lot of communities fall into. The longer people enjoy something, the more they emotionally attach themselves to it. Eventually, they stop seeing it as a privilege and start seeing it as an entitlement. The lesson here is simple. Feelings can shape perception, but they dawn and oppose, rewrite property records. Unfortunately for Willow Creek Estates, they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Back on the ground, the tension was electric. I decided it was time to act, not just talk. The first move was practical, installing a sturdy gate at the main trail entrance. Nothing flashy, just a simple wooden structure with a clear sign. Private property, access by permit only. Within hours, reactions exploded. Residents drove up, slowed their cars, craned their necks, muttering, pointing. Some tried to squeeze around it. Others called the HOA office, their voices rising in collective outrage. And there it was, proof that perception and reality can collide like two speeding trains. Karen Stone called again, her tone sharper than ever. You can't just block access. We've used this land for decades, she said. I tried to keep it calm, even chuckling under my breath. Karen, I'm not taking the woods away. I'm just asserting my legal ownership. There's a difference. She didn't laugh. Instead, she threatened legal action, citing implied easements through long-term use. And here's where the law gets interesting. From a legal perspective, implied easements and adverse possession claims require strict criteria: continuous, open, and notorious use for decades with the owner's tacit consent. None of that applied here. Their maintenance of trails didn't create legal rights. According to standard procedure, the land was unequivocally mine. Still, I knew simply citing the law wouldn't calm down angry neighbors. So I decided to turn the situation into something proactive. I reviewed zoning maps and regulations and discovered that my forest wasn't just a protected backyard. It had potential for mixed-use recreational activities. I called in a conservation consultant, and together we drafted a plan: guided hiking tours, seasonal camping permits, and controlled hunting areas with proper licensing. We designed controlled entry points with parking outside the subdivision and mandatory liability waivers. Basically, I was taking ownership and turning it into a professionally managed, revenue-generating outdoor park. The next weekend, I invited the HOA president and a few board members to walk the property with me, maps in hand. Look, I said, this is all recorded, all surveyed, all legally ours. You can help shape public use, but the ownership isn't up for debate. Karen walked stiffly behind me, her arms crossed, muttering under her breath. We've always maintained it, she started. I nodded. And it looks great. But maintenance doesn't equal ownership. This is about structure, sustainability, and legality. I could see the gears turning in their minds. They were processing that decades of casual assumption couldn't override law, that the property they treated as a backdrop for their homes had a real owner who was about to use it responsibly. Within weeks, the project moved forward. I marked trails, installed informational kiosks, and set up the infrastructure for entry permits. Weekend hikers who had previously strolled freely now had to register for passes. Some argued, some sulked, but many ended up appreciating the new order. Trails were better maintained, benches repaired, invasive species removed, and the forest itself began to recover. Wildlife that had been slowly displaced by informal use started returning. From a psychological perspective, people adapted surprisingly quickly when clear rules were enforced, especially when the rules benefited everyone. Then the legal threats arrived in writing. The HOA board sent a letter claiming that decades of community use had created implied rights, demanding the trails remain open. My attorney responded swiftly, citing state statutes on adverse possession and permissive access. We highlighted that the time requirements for adverse possession hadn't been met, and that their informal maintenance didn't establish ownership. This is the part that fascinates me. Residents genuinely believed they had a claim, yet the law was unambiguous. There's a lesson here. Perception can blind you to reality until the paperwork is in front of you. I finalized all county permits, insurance, and liability coverage. The park officially opened that fall, complete with a small visitor center, guided hikes, and seasonal camping permits. Entry fees funded trail improvements, fire management, and habitat restoration. The irony? Many Willow Creek residents purchased annual passes themselves. The very people who assumed the forest was theirs were now paying to enter legally. Karen Stone, of course, fumed quietly, attending one board meeting after another, realizing the forest had been professionally transformed under private management. What really satisfied me, though, wasn't the money. It was the order, the clarity, the respect for law and process. The forest that had been taken for granted became a managed, protected space. Hikers stayed on marked trails, wildlife thrived, and any previous tension dissolved into something productive. Even some of the more resistant residents admitted, grudgingly, that the forest was healthier and more enjoyable now than when it was everyone's backyard. And that, I think, is the ultimate payoff. When ownership is properly exercised, everyone benefits. The last confrontation came unexpectedly. Tom Reynolds, the guy who had smirked when I first tried to assert boundaries, finally approached me on one of the trails. He looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot. "I guess, this is actually pretty nice," he muttered. I smiled, handing him an annual pass. "Glad you think so. Just remember, structure makes enjoyment possible." That moment felt like poetic justice. People who had once dismissed legal rights now willingly engaged with the system I put in place. And let's be honest, the drama itself had been spectacular. Neighbors who once believed they owned a forest were learning how boundaries, law, and proper management intersect. From a psychological perspective, it's fascinating. When people invest in perception rather than legal reality, reality eventually catches up, and often with consequences that are as educational as they are entertaining. By enforcing clear ownership while simultaneously creating a recreational system that benefited them, I turned potential hostility into collaboration, fear into respect, and confusion into a thriving community resource. By the end of that first season, the park had become self-sustaining. Revenue covered maintenance, insurance, and conservation projects. Trails were safe, signs were accurate, and most importantly, the forest was no longer a victim of assumptions. The HOA had to come to terms with the fact that marketing a community nature preserve they didn't own didn't make it theirs. Ironically, some board members even admitted that the structured approach improved property values, proof that accountability and clarity often outperform casual entitlement. It's tempting to say that the HOA simply learned a lesson in humility, but it's deeper than that. They experienced firsthand the psychological dynamics of entitlement, the social friction of challenging long-held assumptions, and the legal reality that law and perception don't always align. And I, for my part, learned that patience, preparation, and strategic thinking can turn even the most contentious situation into an opportunity. In the end, the forest thrived, the community adapted, and I could walk its trails knowing that every corner was legally mine yet responsibly shared. The conflict that started with signs nailed to trees escalated into a fully managed outdoor recreation park, a space where nature, law, and human behavior intersected in ways I hadn't expected. And that, perhaps, is the most cinematic part of the story, not just the confrontation or the legal battle, but the transformation from chaos into order, from assumption into reality, from entitlement into structured enjoyment. Looking back now, standing at the edge of those woods on a quiet morning, it and Apo's, it's strange how different everything feels. The same trees are still there. The same trails wind through the forest. The same deer wander across the clearings at sunrise. But the atmosphere is completely different. Not because the land changed, because the relationship people have with it changed. When I first inherited those 300 acres, I thought the biggest challenge would be paperwork. Surveys, property records, maybe a few awkward conversations with neighbors. What I didn't and Apo's realize was that I was stepping into something much deeper, a conflict between legal ownership and emotional ownership. And honestly, I understand both sides more now than I did at the beginning. If you live next to a forest for 10 or 15 years, if your kids grow up walking those trails, if your dog runs there every weekend, eventually your brain starts treating that place as part of your life. That and Apo's, normal. That and Apo's, human nature. This is a psychological trap that catches people all the time. The longer we use something, the more we convince ourselves that we deserve it. Not because we and Apo's bad people. Because familiarity creates attachment. Attachment creates expectation. And expectation slowly turns into entitlement. The problem is that reality doesn't and Apo's always care about our expectations. That and Apo's, that's where things get messy. The HOA wasn't and Apo's entirely evil. Now, Don and Apo's, get me wrong, some of their behavior was ridiculous. Putting signs on trees they didn't and Apo's own? Advertising someone else and Apo's property as a community amenity? Threatening legal action without understanding the actual law? Yeah, none of that was exactly brilliant. But beneath all of that was something very human. Fear. Fear of losing something they thought would always be there. Fear of change. Fear of discovering that a story they and Apos had been telling themselves for years wasn't and Apos actually true. And if we and Apos being fair, most people react badly when they and Apos forced to confront that kind of reality. From a legal perspective, however, the situation was always pretty simple. Ownership matters. Records matter. Boundaries matter. According to standard procedure, rights aren't and Apos created because a group of people collectively wishes they existed. They and Apos recreated through law. That and Apos, that's not always exciting. Sometimes it feels unfair. But without clear rules, property ownership becomes whatever the loudest group decides it should be. And that and Apos, a dangerous road. The lesson here is that assumptions are never a substitute for facts. Not in real estate, not in business, not in relationships, not anywhere. One thing that surprised me most was what happened after the conflict ended. Because here in Apos, the part nobody talks about. People adapt. Fast. The same residents who were furious about the gate eventually became regular visitors. The same neighbors who accused me of ruining their preserve started complimenting the trail improvements. The same people threatening lawsuits ended up purchasing annual passes. That and Apos, something worth remembering. Human beings are remarkably resistant to change, right up until they get used to it. Then suddenly they wonder why they were fighting so hard in the first place. And maybe that and Apos, the biggest takeaway from this entire story. Most conflicts aren't and Apos really about land, or trails, or signs, or gates. They and Apos about control. They and Apos about identity. They and Apos about the stories people tell themselves regarding what belongs to them and what doesn't and Apos When those stories get challenged, emotions take over. Logic takes a back seat. That and Apos, exactly what happened here. The HOA wasn't and Apos fighting over 300 acres. They were fighting over a version of reality they had grown comfortable believing. Unfortunately for them, reality had documentation. And documentation tends to win. Every single time. Today, the forest is healthier. Wildlife populations have improved. The trails are safer. The habitat restoration projects are working. Visitors understand the rules. Liability concerns are addressed. And the land is being actively protected instead of casually assumed. Ironically, the outcome turned out better for almost everyone involved. Even the people who fought against it. That and Apos, the part one find funniest. The thing they resisted the hardest ended up becoming the thing they benefited from the most. Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. So now I and Apos am curious what you think. If you had lived in that neighborhood for years and genuinely believed the forest belonged to the community, how would you have reacted when the real owner showed up? Would you have accepted the survey and moved on? Would you have fought the decision? Or would you have tried to negotiate some kind of compromise? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And honestly, that and Apos, that's what makes them interesting. At the end of the day, this wasn't and Apos just a story about 300 acres of land. It was a story about assumptions, about ownership, about human nature, and about what happens when the person everyone forgot about finally walks through the door and says 4 very simple words. End quote. Actually, this belongs to me. End quote.